Welcome everyone. This is an honors event, but also brings together many other units on campus, and we're very happy about that. It's great to bring in awesome speakers from other institutions, but we like it even more in honors when we can bring in the awesome speakers that we have on campus, and that's what we have today. The person who's going to be doing the main presentation, because we're all going to be talking about her book, is Theresa Hernández, over here. I'm sure many of you know her already. She's the undergraduate director of the World Cultures and Literature program here, as well as the director of Jewish Studies. And she is also an honors fellow. We're proud to have her as that. She's a woman of remarkable experience and intellectual passion. Among other things that she's done is she's a photographer, and you're running a class in the spring, right? The photography class, which is that still open? Yes. So if you're a student, you might really want to do that. She has a PhD in cultural anthropology from Rice University and a master's in social work. And you have a former life, right, doing social work. And I suspect that's maybe where you got interested in people's stories. I see a continuity in three books here. Delirio, The Fantastic, the Demonic, and the Real, The Buried History of Nuevo Leon from 2002. Cemeteries of Ambivalent Desire, Unearthing Narrative from the Deep South in a Texas Graveyard from 2008. And the book we're talking about today, which I think, yes, we have the cover there, The Virgin of Guadalupe and the Conversos from 2014. And we'll be talking more about that. I'll actually say a few things in a minute. As respondents, we're very pleased to have another honors fellow and very distinguished faculty member, Lois Zamora. She is professor of English and Art and the chair of the Comparative Cultural Studies Department and co-director of the Center for the Americas. And I met her first as an interim dean many years ago.
And I hired him. It's one of my famous best moments.
That's right. So if you don't like that, complain to her. But I was, remember way back when, getting the Center for the Americas started. She's the author of many books, including The Baroque New Worlds, The Inordinate Eye, The Usable Past, many books in English and translated into Spanish as well. So she is obviously an excellent person to have as a respondent to this work of Maria Teresa's. We also are pleased to have from the Department of History, Jose Angel Hernández, not a relation, I get it, okay? Associate Professor of History in the History Department, whose book, Mexican-American Colonization During the 19th Century, A History of U.S.-Mexico Borderlands, has won several awards. And welcome. I don't know if this is your first time here in the Commons, but you are very welcome. Let me just say this. If you've read this book, and you're about to see the presentation, it will change the way you see one of the great iconic figures in Christian piety in Mexico and in Spain, the Virgin of Guadalupe. It is an amazing and interesting journey, this book. Part Dan Brown, part cultural history. And I think that it's funny when you think about someone who traces a historical thesis of this sort, a kind of hidden history. It is a lot of fun to see exactly what this kind of counter-narrative kind of work can be like. And it naturally makes me think of Star Trek. Seriously. You all know Mr. Spock, Leonard Nimoy. An interesting fact about him is he grew up in a rather traditional Jewish family in Boston. And he claimed that being someone between cultures helped him in crafting the role of Mr. Spock. But he tells a very interesting story about how when he was a young man, there we go, we have the young one here now, we can really party. He tells an interesting story about when he was a young man. He went to the synagogue with his father, a fairly traditional Jewish community, and they were there at the moment they were doing the priestly benediction. And his father told him, "Don't look." And he saw everyone pulling the talit over their faces, and he heard these guys up in front making this kind of caterwauling that he didn't understand, and it totally freaked him out. And he later learned that what that's all about during the priestly blessing is the traditional idea is that the Shekhinah will be present at that moment, which is the feminine aspect of God or the presence of God. It can be interpreted in different ways. If you look, you can be blinded or perhaps even die from being in the direct presence of God this way. And so many years later, when he came to put together a particular episode, which which is when Mr. Spock goes back to the planet Vulcan. He was talking to the director and said, we need some kind of greeting because, we haven't really thought out the culture of the Vulcans. And he immediately came up with one, which was this, of course. And this is the priestly benediction gesture of the Kohanim that he saw as a boy, that he saw was so uncanny and bizarre. And it's the letter Shin in Hebrew. For Shaddai is in El Shaddai or Shalom or in Shekinah. And what was interesting is the woman he was doing the sign to was a Viennese Jewish actress who immediately saw what that was. And this became a cultural icon in America very quickly, he said. And he always found it funny that people didn't realize that they were actually blessing each other when they do this. But to this day, apparently, everyone on the street flashes the sign. So that's a great example of something hidden in plain view from Jewish tradition. And what the book is about, and the thesis you're about to hear, is to take this iconic symbol of the Virgin of Guadalupe and show you the hidden meaning. So without further ado, Theresa. Is it dark enough? I guess this is what we can do.
Yeah, I think I need the clicker so I can...
Did they? Ah! With any luck, it works. Let's see. Yes? Hello.
Before I get started, there's two things I would like to mention, and of course, what I say very briefly is never enough. But as some of you do know, the Virgin of Guadalupe is considered the Mother of Christ. She is one of the variations of the Virgin Mary, Mother of God, in Catholicism, early Christianity, or Christianity until the Reformation. And considered, in the Americas especially, the Virgin of Guadalupe is considered the most important religious figure in Latin America, especially in the history of Mexico. She is considered the patroness of Mexico, and she is represented in this way. And the story about her is that she appeared in 1531 just outside of Mexico City. And her identity is seen as the identity of Mexico. As the director of her shrine told me a few years ago when I spoke with him, everything that comes through the Basilica of Guadalupe is about Mexico, and everything about Mexico comes through here. There's also another thing to clarify, is that I will be speaking about what some people call secret Jews. There's a lot of controversy regarding what to call people that are the descendants of Jews who converted from Judaism to Christianity. Some people call them secret Jews, some call them crypto Jews, some call them Conversos, to convert, some call them Marranos, which I don't like because I believe it's very offensive even today. And even these terms are never adequate, because a Converso that converted in 1500 is spoken of as a Converso in 1700, but what we're really talking about is the descendants of Conversos. So please excuse me for my lack of a better term, but we still haven't figured that one out. A few years ago, I found a mountain of handwritten pages produced by a priest named Manuel Espinosa de los Monteros, who in about 1825 in Mexico City wrote a text about the Virgin of Guadalupe. He was working in the Basilica of the Virgin, and in his papers it was clear that he was either a secret Jew or a very serious Christian heretic. He wrote many things about the Virgin, including that she would bring the Hebrew nation back to its former glory, that in her eyes she appeared as a dead woman, that the Mexican nation would come back at the end of the millennium, and Guadalupe would be the queen, and the Catholic Church would go down. Of course, that was in some pages. In other pages, he said that the Catholic Church would maintain its strength. What appeared so intriguing was that Monteros wrote this several hundred years after historians said there were no more secret Jews in Mexico, or Spain for that matter. The project came in from the question of how did secret Jews continue to exist long after the Spanish and Mexican Inquisition drove them out or forced them to convert. What I found out was that the secret Jews were always present in the history of colonial Spain and Mexico, at least according to my observations. Even before the time of Columbus, the Jews had an integral role in the administration of the Spanish church and the monarchy. The programs of the late 1300s led many to enter the monastic order of the Hieronymites, or the Jerónimos. They were scattered throughout Spain, but their main monastery in the 1400s was the Monasterio de Guadalupe, which was built in honor of the Spanish Virgin of Guadalupe. Now, some people say, what's the connection between her, because she is quite different from the one in Mexico. And what I say is, no, there isn't really a connection in the sense that she is not Jewish at all. However, they lived in her monastery. They were known to be an order that was full of conversos. And in the 1400s, a number were burned at the stake for practicing Jewish rituals and never having been converted to Catholicism, but yet performing Mass and giving Holy Communion inside the monastery. What many of our contemporary historical writings do not mention in the guy, the Marchena was his name, that was burned at the stake, was that the presence of the Jews in the Hieronymites order did not end when Marchena was killed. There's a book, In the Shadow of the Virgin, that talks about this and says, well, after Marchena was burned at the stake, they were all gone. Well, that's not true. Another historian, Sophie Kosmacher, who did an amazing dissertation, 700 pages, on the Jerónimos and traveled throughout Spain to all the different monasteries and went through all their archives, said that all they did were sent to different monasteries. And everything started all over again and went underground for a short time. Thus, the story continued through the centuries. And during the time of the Catholic kings, the most important religious official, Archbishop Cisneros, even established an order of clergy for specifically descendants of converted Jews. One of his best friends, who also happened to be the secretary of the Catholic kings, was the son of a family who continued to openly observe Jewish rites in their home. His brother, Garcia Zapata de Alvarez, or de Madrid, was later burned at the stake. And Cisneros, the priest that, the archbishop, and later a priest named Benito Arias Montano, who's a very important person in this whole story, each published versions of the Bible that were laid out in Hebrew, Latin, and Aramaic at the beginning of the 1500s and at the end of the 1500s. These Bibles, known as the polyglots, were produced at the cost of millions of dollars in present-day money. Arias Montano specifically was instrumental in sending hundreds of censored books to the Americas. His own Bible came to be in Mexican libraries, and Manuel Espinosa de los Monteros, the priest in Mexico City that was writing in 1825, cites Arias Montano in his own writings. I also found the most important book that was published during the colonial period, which is called Imagen de la Virgen María de Guadalupe. It was published in 1648 by another priest at the same basilica named Miguel Sanchez. This priest talks about the apparitions of Guadalupe and presents basically what he believes to be the structure of the emergence of the Mexican nation state. And to this day, the book has been republished numerous times and always continuously discussed as a book that is related to the construction of Mexico. But what I found was something else. Inside his book, he mentions the havoc and terror brought on by the Mexican Inquisition that was very active during that period. Sanchez also tells his readers to pray secretly to be rescued. In a postscript to the book, a colleague of Sanchez notes that the book brings up what cannot be thought, along with a long description of Queen Esther, who's known to be a representative of the secret Jews in the Americas. A century and a half later, Manuel Espinosa de los Monteros writes his unexplainable thesis. It somehow leaves the basilica in Mexico City and accompanies an important government official in his escape to Paris after the French intervention. This is around 1865. After this man's death, it is sold in auction in London. And during my research on a previous book, I read and was continuously informed that after the Inquisition, cleansed Mexico of the Jews in 1648 and 1649, there were no secret Jews left in Spain. The documents left behind by Manuel Espinosa de los Monteros morphed into something that is not quite Jewish, yet apparently a blending of Judaism and Catholicism, which in a strict traditional sense would not be accepted as any part of any dogma. A noted scholar of crypto-Jews, Nathan Wachtel, notes that many descendants of Conversos became millennialists, which is how Monteros could be described. He wrote of how in the millennium the Jews would return and join Christ, yet his new kingdom would be Hebrew, not Christian. What Montero's writings demonstrates is that religious beliefs and traditions are not easily eradicated. There are always traces that remain of our past. Thank you. I kept it brief because I thought we could have a really good conversation between the three of us. And there's so much more. The book covers absolutely everything. But I think that might be a better introduction at this point.
Well, I guess I might start. I think I will stand because the last row there on the couch is a little low. I was very interested to read Dr. Hernández's book because I myself have a book of about 10 years ago on the Virgin of Guadalupe and other things. My field is literature, but I used her image to talk about Mexican literature in ways that I might not have been able to otherwise. And what I was struck by in Theresa's book is that it's about, you start in 1648 in some ways with the Sanchez text, but literature people love to talk about a Nahuatl text that was written probably in about 1556. Figure 1531 is the date, according to legend and deep-seated belief, that the Virgin appeared to an indigenous man named Juan Diego. And there is a verbatim account of their conversation when the Virgin comes. And some of you will know this very well if you're Mexican or if you've studied Mexico. But I thought maybe I would just give a little bit of the backstory of the Virgin. Now, I'm sorry, I don't mean to take over the conversation, but somehow that seemed to me to be something that when you read the book, you might wonder about previous instantiations of this text or this narrative, this story, this legend, this miracle. And so 1551, Juan Diego is walking along according to a narrative called the Nican Mopulua, which is in Nahuatl, the language of the Mexicas, the Aztecs. It means, thus it's told. It's the first words in the text. And it is in a kind of literary Nahuatl because in 1531, remember the conquest of Mexico was 1521. So there was still a literary tradition and a linguistic tradition, and of course continued and continues to this day. There are 1 million Nahuatl speakers in Mexico now. So what happens is that Juan Diego is walking along and he hears someone and he sees someone, and it's the Virgin of Guadalupe. And she says, I want a house to be built on this spot. And go tell the bishop, Sumarraga, that I want this to happen. He goes to the bishop, but the bishop says, I don't believe you, or I can't do that right at the moment. He comes back to the spot, and again the Virgin appears to him and says, gather roses and take them to the bishop. And so he does, and when he goes to the bishop and is received by the bishop, he opens his tilma, T-I-L-M-A, it's the apron that indigenous men wore, and out come the roses, and there is imprinted the image of the Virgin. So when you see the image of the Virgin, not the Spanish one, but the Mexican one, it's always the same. And that piece of cloth exists in the Basilica in Mexico City on December 12th, the day of the Virgin of Guadalupe. 6 million people from all over Mexico congregate at the Basilica for the day of this very important Virgin. And if you know Mexico or go to Mexico, you'll see that the Virgin is everywhere. Her image, always the same, is on every cab stand. It's everywhere. It's in restaurants, it's in grocery stores. So she is indeed, as Theresa said, an incredibly important image and force and patron in Mexico, and increasingly in the southwestern United States, as you probably know. So that's the story of her appearance, but how do we overhear this conversation, because we have it. Kids in Catholic school in Mexico study the Nican Mopua, translated into Spanish, of course. But there it is. I actually brought along a copy that I have of 4 different Spanish translations from the Nahuatl to the Spanish. And this conversation goes on, the different stages of the apparition, the different apparitions, the leaving of the image on the tilma. This is all told to us. Who wrote that down? Not Juan Diego. It's said, and literature people go with this argument more than maybe historians do, that in 1556, a literate indigenous man named Valeriano, by then he had a Spanish last name, wrote it as a drama to show to indigenous Mexicans at the behest of the then Bishop of Mexico. So that's 30 years, let's say, almost 28, 27 after the apparition. The text in question in Theresa's book by Sanchez, which is also super important, is 117 years after the apparition. So the Nahuatl text of the meeting, this amazing moment in Mexican history or belief systems, whatever you want to say, is documented in Nahuatl, and it's very affecting. I even brought some quotes from the Nican Mopua to read to you, but I don't think I need to do that. One more detail, and then I promise I won't talk anymore, or we'll chat, is that along about the middle of the 1700s, middle 18th century, we start to see on the images of the Guadalupe, always the same Virgin, always looking as she looked, and as this piece of cloth, which is up on behind the altar of the Basilica, there starts to be a ribbon of language in Latin, and it is non fecit taliter omni nationi. He has not done this to anyone else, he being God. What does this mean? It means that long about the middle of the 1700s, Mexico starts to claim a position as the Israelites. Mexico starts to say, we're the chosen people because God gave us the Virgin of Guadalupe. So and that phrase is from Psalms 147, 20th verse, if that's of interest. It was referring in the Psalms, of course, to the Israelites, to the Hebrew people, the chosen people of God. So there becomes a rather standard metaphoric substitution of Mexico for Jerusalem, and of Mexicans for the Israelites as God's chosen people. So there's quite a lot of reference to the Hebrew Bible, to the Israelites, but it's a metaphoric substitution, or so I've thought, rather than a reference to secret Jews. So you've given me a new way to think about this phrase, which is very important in Mexico. Omni, I'll do it again. No, sorry. Non fecit taliter omni natione. He has not done this to any other people or for any other people. So there is the connection to the Guadalupe, and another one is the apocalyptic virgin that she also is, that before Theresa's book, we might have taken as metaphoric substitution, but now we'll have to think about it in more complex and historicized ways, really. So I just wanted to give a little background on the Virgin because I'm a devotee myself, in fact, and I think almost anyone who knows Mexico well becomes eventually a Guadalupana in one way or another. So.
I'll sit if that's okay.
Please can.
But my comments will be very, very brief, mostly in the forms of questions. I always try to appreciate my context, and in this context, I think I'll defer to the experts that know more about the topic, obviously, than I do, and people that have actually had more background, like yourself, Lois. So, I think I will prefer to hear you say, more things about this than the questions I'm asking. Because I read it I read the book like everybody else usually reads material, from their own subjectivity, from their own perspective, trying to extrapolate and trying to read into things, instances or things that are familiar from their own subjectivity. And so myself as a 19th century Mexicanist, I agree with everything that's been said, especially what you've already pointed out, Lois. And so in that sense, I think the book struck me as quite subversive. I'll say one thing right away is that when Theresa contacted me about presenting here, she had mentioned in our brief meeting only a few weeks ago that she says, I hear it's a page turner. I took that to heart, and by the time she contacted me, only a few days later, I was already halfway through the book when you contacted me, and so I was able to complete it. And so, in that sense, reading it as a 19th century Mexicanist, I thought it was very subversive. And for today's presentation, I mostly just had a few questions, which build a little bit on what you've already pointed out, Lois, which is the sort of the, maybe the dates are different, but the 1645 text, the Nican Mopoa, which Professor Zamora has already pointed out, this text that was written in the, I don't want to say original, because at that point it's already in the Latin script, the Nahua language, discussing the 1530 apparition of the Virgin of Guadalupe. So according to some historians, I'm thinking here obviously of the work of Stafford Poole's book on the Virgin of Guadalupe, where he points out immediately in his text that you have the myth goes that the apparition is in 1530, but the first actual written document, according to him, is the 1645 text, if I'm not mistaken, the Nican Mopoa. And so in that context, right, I think the question that emerges immediately, because one of the things that he does say about the Virgin of Guadalupe is that for the criollos, these Spaniards that have been born in the so-called New World, that for them, the Virgin of Guadalupe and the apparition of the Virgin of Guadalupe represents not only a validation of who they are as a people, as a person, but that they are also the chosen people, right? So here you have the apparition of the Virgin, not in Judea, to quote him, but this time in Mexico, right? So the second apparition, in other words, of the Virgin. The first time in Judea, the second time in Mexico. So in that sense, my question, and I was hoping you could sort of maybe touch on it, is to what extent does the Virgin become basically a symbol upon which each and every other ethnic group or religious group, like I myself read the book, projects upon it their own subjectivity. So for instance, as you were saying about the Nican Mopoa, people that are discussing the sort of the new philology in Mexico, especially with Nahua studies, will harp on the fact that the Virgen de Guadalupe is this sort of this symbol that shows up on the hill of Tepeyac and this place of where it was the birthplace of Tonantzin. Now it's been converted into this sort of Catholic symbol. For the criollos, it means, like I said earlier about Stafford Poole. For Conversos, it perhaps means this particular interpretation, right, or analysis. So I was hoping you could say a few things about to what degree do you think the Virgin, serves as the sort of symbol upon which these groups sort of project their own imaginings. And the second broader group, and because I have a couple of about at least half a dozen of my students from my history of my world history course to 1500, is to what degree do you think this fits within the larger history of the Catholic Church and their appropriation, for instance, of various kinds of practices, symbols, cultural practices, cultural modalities, idols, etc. How do you think this would fit within the larger sort of trajectory of the Catholic Church, sort of appropriating certain symbols from culture? I mean, the obvious case is Ireland, I think. But how would you sort of address that question to sort of somebody asking a basic question like that? So I think in that sense, I'll just ask or pose those two questions and defer to the experts that know more about the details than I do.
Well, for one, I don't say I'm a Guadalupe specialist. I had an interest in, actually before I found the Montero's papers in New York, I was thinking of writing about Guadalupe and Malinche and the White Virgin Marys to see how they would represent the issue of color in Mexico and race. But then I found the Montero's papers and kind of went back to my original work from my first book, which was on Conversos in northern Mexico. When I talk about this book, it's not, and I say this early on, this does not question the apparition. I'm not saying that she didn't appear. I'm not saying any of that. It's all there. I'm not questioning anything from anything that anyone said. What I'm saying is that I believe that Miguel Sanchez was writing perhaps partly because of his religious beliefs, but also one of the main things that was pushing him were the events of the particular moment that were going on when he produced the book. The book appears between the two most difficult, most intense and bloody Inquisition trials in Auto de Fe in the history of Mexico, which is very interesting. The book was, it was commissioned by a viceroy that died a few days after the first Inquisition trial. It was in the middle of the Palafox controversy, which is another story of the king sending a bishop over to try to shake everything up, and he did, and had to run in hiding in the long run. There were a lot of things, I think, going on. I don't question Miguel Sanchez's belief in Christ and belief in the church, but at the same time, I think that he was trying to address something. There is a passage I wanted to read here that he's talking about something that happened. Let me see if I can. Okay, he is saying, and this is something that in all the years, all the writings I've seen on this book, it's been only mentioned once, and that was recently by Solange Albero, which is his mention of the Inquisition. I'd never seen a book like this ever talk about the Inquisition, and this is what Sanchez says. I do not believe that there is a street, a corner, a plaza, or a neighborhood that does not have many holy crosses exhibited with sacred veneration. In these years, with a singular aim, I have noted this pattern, as is publicly known, the never-waning, notorious vigilance, the apostolic solicitude, and irrefutable zeal of the very holy tribunal for the Inquisition has discovered, sentenced with its accustomed mercy, so many enemies of our holy faith. But he's saying something is going on. And that's just one piece. There were many, many things I noted, and this was after I photographed the original copies of the book that were at the Benson Library in Austin. There's also a part in there where he's talking about the children praising the Holy Cross in order to confound their enemies, which I know is part of a psalm. And there also in the postscript, one of his friends, his colleague, mentions that he is writing what cannot be thought. And in addition to that, his colleague also writes several paragraphs on Queen Esther, who was the representation of crypto-Jews because she was a Jew in hiding herself. I'm not denying the importance of Guadalupe in the least. I'm not denying the apparition at all. What I'm saying is that I believe Sanchez appropriated her in that particular instance at a number of different levels and integrated her own existence to his beliefs. There's also the question, like you said, about, well, do different groups do that? Well, I think culture's that way. I think religions are that way. I remember talking to, I think was Casey DeWay Hackney from our department a while back, and we were talking about the Eleusinian mysteries, and I was talking to her and Francesca Baer, and they were both saying, well, you know, these big religions, which the Eleusinian mysteries, right, they were so popular for 2,000 years, they sort of transition into another one, and they take pieces of themselves, move forward into the others. And so that's how I see it. Of course, it's very problematic because the Catholic Church would say, no, this is crazy. You know, right. Monteros was a heretic, there's no way. And of course, in modern Judaism, none of this is considered appropriate. And in fact, when the book was first, going to press or being considered for publication, readers said, you can't use the term Jews. These are not Jews because they are not following rabbinic law. So I think it's just the way kind of cultures take on particular things. And the Virgin of Guadalupe may mean something to someone in 1640 in Mexico, could mean something else definitely in 2014 in New York City. They change, but the writings stay the same, but the interpretations, maybe they change, or maybe sometimes people see things they didn't see before, or they see things they weren't allowed to see before, which I can say is a very important journal that we all respect, that many of us know of, that publishes Latin American texts and critiques, told me they couldn't publish an article that I wrote on this because if they questioned Guadalupe in that manner, they would be shut down. And this was just a few years ago.
Would you, oh, there's a question. Great.
Yeah, I think now we can open for questions. Do you want to get us started?
Yeah, thanks, always. Thank you all. This is really fascinating. Lois, thank you for reminding us of the historical constructs. One of the things that's really fascinating about this, Citizen, and your project is how elastic this concept is and how it is appropriated by dramatically different political agendas. And I'm thinking of La Raza that uses this image. I'm thinking of Gloria Anzadua's work that uses this image. I'm thinking of Chicana feminist. I'm thinking of the lowriders over here on the other side of 45 that appropriate this image. The elasticity is really the fascinating construct in this. Are there other images that are in fact as elastic as this concept and construct that facilitate, the crypto Jew, the identity that is in many ways trying to be visible in an invisible way?
There are, I've been working on a project the last few years, which will be an ethnography of descendants of Conversos, or crypto Jews. And the only thing that has come up in recently is that in Del Rio, there was a family who told me that they used the triangle or the shape of a diamond to show who they were. And they took me to a cemetery, and there were a lot of graves that had this, or had triangles. But this was just in one place, and I asked them, can you tell me of anyone else? And they said no. However, there are other things. Let's see, the lily is also, and that's been stated by other scholars of this subject. Really, that's, well, of course, the Star of David, which of course is a standard thing, but it's interesting, the gravestones that I've seen will have a Star of David and then they'll have a cross. And that's the one thing that I see over and over again when I'm looking at this. It will be the combination of the two, which again, in Judaism, that's considered wrong. But the families that talk to me, because there are still a number in the present day that are very, very emotionally involved in this whole idea, will tell me, we are Jews, and our family always said we were Jews, always. It didn't matter if we went to church, we had to, because if not, we would die. And there's been lots of controversy. In fact, just as recently as last week, I was talking to a family who the mother was raised very much in this tradition in Tamaulipas, in Santander Jimenez. And she immigrated when she was 10 years old. This is a very highly educated family. She worked at the Baylor Medical School in Dallas for a number of years. And her son, who's in his 30s, grew up going to Hebrew school and everything, but was born of a mother who was a converso. And in the 70s, she married a Jew, and she went to the synagogue and said, what do I do? And they said, oh, it's fine. Just you believe what you believe, you're fine. Of course, things have changed since then. Well, now the young man is marrying a conservative Jew, originally from Morocco, who has lived in Israel. And he's catching all sorts of things, and he's been told he's got to study for 3 years to convert. And he's very, very, very angry. And I hear those stories pretty often.
Could I just say something, sorry, 1 second, about the power of the image? I'm going to stand up because I can't see some of you, and as a teacher, I feel like I have to keep an eye on you. Or you have to keep an eye on me. I think that the Virgin of Guadalupe's image is very particular, and particularly strong. When I was teaching in Mexico, I asked some of my students, can you think of any analog in the US? Because some of them knew the US. Somebody proposed Mickey Mouse, somebody proposed Marilyn Monroe. We don't have a powerful image like the Virgin of Guadalupe, and as flexible as you were pointing out, somebody who can contain so much meaning and different meanings. But I would argue that that's because of the nature of the image itself. She did appear according to legend and long deep-seated belief. I always say that because historically, well, it depends on if you're a believer or not, but let's say she appeared in 1531, 10 years after the conquest. What there is a huge collision of semiotic systems. There's the Western way of representing an image. In Catholicism, you don't worship any visual image. You see plenty of beautiful images, but they're to remind you of the spirit that they represent. They don't present it. They're not the thing itself. Look at the cloth the Virgin left with her image. This is very much an indigenous idea, that if a sculptor, for example, sculpts a beautiful image of, let's say, Huitzilopochtli or Quetzalcoatl, the spirit will recognize its image and inhabit it. So in Mexico, for example, at the pyramids, whichever pyramids you choose to go to, you'll see people putting their hands on the stone, that it's the thing itself that has the spirit in it. So there are two real different, as I say in my book, ontologies of the image, ways of thinking about how images present or represent what they show. So I think your question is really well taken, and your answer too very interesting, in that this is a very particular kind of conjunction of cultures where, on the one hand, indigenous, the image was and is the spirit. It contains it. It doesn't just point to it and say, you want to think of a rabbit's foot or something where, something that the thing itself matters. So that cloth has been tested and retested and tested again as science progresses to make sure that it's not really of earthly material. That, of course, that terrible contradiction of trying to prove something scientifically that doesn't even argue that it's scientific. But I just think that's such an interesting question. I think the image is so powerful because of the conjunction of cultures that produced it, really. So that was my idea.
One thing I'd have to say is that if you just look on the web, and from that time frame, there are a number of Virgin Marys that are very similar, produced out of Germany, that will have the moon at the bottom and the rays around her, but she'll be white. There's a good number of them. I met a physician, biochemist, who was on faculty at UTSA. This was maybe even as long as 10, 13 years ago. And his name was Garza Valdez. I think he was originally from General Terán, Nuevo León, but he was educated in the States. And he took a number of photographs, and he gave me the photographs, I have them, of the tilma. And he did infrared, and you can see other drawings underneath it. But he said that he ended up having a very strong disagreement with the Archbishop and was obviously not allowed to show it. But I have about 100 images that show it even down to the fibers. Yeah, and there also, I think there was a child in the first image. But it doesn't matter to me. She's still just as powerful.
And it's the thing itself.
Yeah, it's what we've put into it. It's what the way Lois says. It's what we've put into it. There's something else too, and I write about this in the book that I think is very interesting. As I started really thinking about the whole idea of the Shekinah, which is the feminine aspect of God in Judaism, is that like you cannot see God, because if you do, you'll die. And so the burning around her, the light, or as Sanchez would say, or even as Monteros also said, is that the woman clothed with the sun, it burns, but it doesn't burn her. And so I started wondering if maybe she could be representing the Shekinah in the sense, or the protection for us as human beings to stand in front of God, because God would be the rays, and she's standing in front, and she's keeping us from dying by looking at her, which is another possibility.
Dr. Zucker has a comment or a question?
A bit of both.
You might want to stand up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. I lived about 7 years in Santa Fe, where, of course, Our Lady of Guadalupe is tremendously important. You mentioned growing importance in the Southwest, but I mean, even back to the Pueblo Uprising of 1680, she was the figure of reconciliation that made possible kind of going forward after that, the end of the war of blood and fire. So this is really amazing to me to think about. Well, one thing I wanted to point out in terms of the ontology of the image, it's not simply an indigenous way of thinking that would say, the material itself is important, because of course this has parallels in the Shroud of Turin, and antecedents in what the Greeks would call archaeopoiete, icons not made by human hands, the Veronicas, the Mandilions, and other images like that. So actually there's a deep tradition, even in European Christianity, of images embodying the power of God or the saints. So that might be something to think about, that it's a confluence of cultures that's made possible because both cultures are actually quite open to it. And that actually brings up the question I have, because I've heard quite a bit about different cultures, kind of confluence of the cultures or appropriations, but I was thinking about the religious contours of this. That what you highlight very nicely in your work, both from Conversos and Sanchez, is not simply that they're articulating kind of a Judaism against Christianity, but an articulation of a common fund of religious imagery and ideas that can be emphasized in different ways. That they have ambivalence toward the Roman Catholic Church, but not so much toward Christ, which I thought was very intriguing, because it doesn't seem to play along the lines that one might expect, that these are hard and fast religious distinctions. And I was wondering if you could comment on some of the ways in which you found that this is, shall we say, that Our Lady of Guadalupe might be at the center of an articulation of competing cultural identities, which are themselves contoured around different emphases in the religious traditions. And we're going to bring it back to the religious traditions a bit more than maybe we've heard so far this afternoon.
Well, in my research, I have to say that, like the families that I've talked to, they generally don't. The families that say they have Jewish ancestry, they don't connect the Guadalupe with themselves. It's basically these two authors that specifically do. And I'm wondering, as you were talking, I was thinking, okay, where they are inside the basilica, or the colegiata, as they called it, where the most important Catholic shrine in the Americas, right? They're both housed there at different points in time, centuries apart. They're both eccentric men, very, very erudite. They say Sanchez had memorized all of St. Augustine by heart. And obviously Monteros, in his own way, I mean, was an extremely, extremely erudite and well-read man. Obviously he had read Montano, and cites a number of very, very highly important theologians that were writing, say, from the early modern period on. I don't think she was appropriated, at least in terms of a Jewish thing. I think it was maybe just these two that might have, because they were there. I think it's so important and so interesting that they were both in the same place, even though centuries apart, and we're writing about her. Let me read to you a little bit about what Montero said about her. Here is one where he actually signs this one with the pseudonym Pio signs. The holiest virgin, in the role of the representative of the Hebrew nation, is the first wife reestablished to her ancient dignity and is protected by her beloved, the Judaic church that is not founded on only one rock of limited size, but over the same rock as Christ, as you said together, that was separated without the hands of humans and occupies the entire world as a wilderness. I think it's fascinating. I don't know if I answered your question.
You get one. Sorry. You have a.
I was just going to say, it's certainly very suggestive, and it hints that more work should be done in the kind of religious tradition, because it's you have not only the kind of the crypto Jews and the kind of Catholics, but you also have the natives in this, and their role. And he has not done this for any other nation. It's something that can be said by the native peoples. This is their moment too. It's not simply what the Spaniards have appropriated from it, but they can appropriate that. There's a lot of back and forth that was fascinating.
I'm just wondering who else was in on this. They were the only ones that wrote about it, but who else could have been involved in the conversation? But at this point, we don't know. I'm thinking there might be something in the Juan Bautista Munoz papers in New York. I'm thinking there might be more, but as of this point, I haven't found one. Although this is a stack of papers this high Richard's seen them. And he told me once, he said, you're going to be working on these the rest of your life. It was an amazing, amazing thing to find.
Guillermo, you want to comment?
Yes, felicidades, Theresa.
Thank you.
For this. I remember when you gave a talk of one of the chapters several years ago. That it was an interesting talk, and thank you to the panelists. But your work, I haven't read the book, but I'm looking forward to read it. But I was thinking about two key words, hybridity and authenticity. I mean, usually we think hybridity when we think about Guadalupe is Spanish and indigenous, right? But without thinking about all the what it means to be Spanish, before all the convivencia, you know, these Moriscos, Muslims, and the Conversos in this case, Jews and all that. That in this case, I think there is some new hybridities that we need to bring, as you did, to the discussion. Because also, I believe that the Conversos are not Jews. They're Conversos, and during that time, they were forced to do something, right? The Inquisition was after them, and idolatry, which they were in that. I mean, in the Americas, idolatry, and in Spain, you know, they were after these the new Christians to see that they behave properly. So I think we need to think about these new hybridities and to see what happened with the convivencia. That is usually Americo Castro talks about it in Spain, Maria Rosa Menocal. But what about this convivencia? We usually reduce it to the castas and the mestizos and the criollos and all that, but all the different kinds of criollos and venezolanos. What about them? And I congratulate you for that, to bring that particular set of intellectuals. And the other is authenticity, because what is authentic here? Is this an indigenous virgin? Is this a converse? I mean, it's quite interesting that it could be all, right? Or none of the above, or all of the above. So I think that's something really important to bring, because it could be a Chicana virgin, it could be a virgin Nahuatl, or a convert. I mean, a virgin with some converso elements. So I think that's something very key that we need to think about these particular symbols and the authenticity. Which do we? I mean, because once, as Nancy Faris says, once the Spaniards came to the New World, I mean, the Spanish hand, everything they touch changed everything. There is no, I mean, can we think what is truly authentic? I mean, is Valeriano's narrative, is that a narrative that was written by Valeriano? What was the influence? And also, I don't know if you work with Luis Lasso de la Vega, which a year after Sanchez, but that is another, you know, account, which is quite interesting. So there are many elements here that we need to consider, and I thank you for considering this particular aspect.
Well, one thing I can say in terms of hybridity or convivencia is that one thing I found as I was doing this research, that at the time of Sanchez, when Palafox when the king sent Palafox and turned everything upside down, the Royal Pontifical University where Sanchez attended and was educated was allowing conversos. There was no rule. There was no statutes where people of mixed blood were refused. They only did not want people that were indigenous. But if they had a Jewish ancestry, it wasn't a problem until Palafox got there. So it's kind of interesting that in terms of convivencia, it might have been going on a lot longer than we thought, than I would have thought.
My question was, did you use, for example, the controversies that Bernardino de Sahagún, or for example later Fray Servando, they questioned, or they were against some of the laws? Did you discuss that in your?
Not really. I think I mentioned like in one sentence Servando. No, I didn't. Actually, one that I didn't mention, but I spent a lot of time looking at was Iscazabeta. I can never say his name right. Yes. Yeah, and a number of other texts that I was looking at. But again, I didn't spend a lot of time on them because I thought I wanted to really focus more on who was saying that she had a connection. I didn't see a connection to any Jewish things in the other texts at all.
fellow in the front row here is very patient.
You have a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So if I was following the summary that you gave correctly, it seemed like this crypto-Jewish appropriation of the Virgin of Guadalupe implied sort of this millenarianism, right, that departed from the Catholic interpretation of it, insofar as you have kind of this change in who is identified as being the chosen people, right? But I'm wondering whether or not the Messianism implicit there sort of is in conflict with the Catholic one in a more fundamental way. And I'm kind of thinking of like works by political anthropologists like Pierre Clastres, who argues that like the millenarianism among indigenous groups in Brazil that he looks at is kind of fundamentally opposed to the kind of monotheism of the Messianism that you find, which are associated though by these groups though with the European state and its centralizing character. So I wonder if rather than simply being this sort of new Messianism that replaces the Jews for the Christians, if instead what you have is a kind of a sort of Messianism that's more fundamentally opposed in some way to this Catholic vision of millenarianism.
I think you're right, Dewey, because I think it's so fascinating, especially Monteros, because for Monteros, he's saying basically he doesn't use the word, but the Messiah for him is the Virgin. So he's not going about it in the way we would expect. I mean, she is the one that's going to come and take everything over, and she's going to be more important than Christ, he says. And although there's times he says, oh, the church is wonderful and I'm a firm believer, but there's many other times he says the church is full of dragons and all the priests are evil, and a lot of different things like that. He also mentions one individual, that it turned out to be actually historically accurate, that wanted to set up a Jewish home, a Jewish homeland off of the island of Niagara, well, off of Niagara Falls. And I looked it up, and sure enough, it was all over the newspapers from that time. So he had a very, very interesting view of all of this. So, but he said he did believe in Christ. So.
I was wondering what this story that you take all the way back to Spain again tells us about the porous and at times ineffectual nature of the Inquisition, which is often seen to be this monolithic thing. The reason why I say that is it made me think of something years ago. At Yale, the Benedictine Library, I was looking at a manuscript of Dante that had been purged by an inquisitor. And there's a particularly notorious few lines about the donation of Constantine, which is historically a discredited document that basically gave the Pope temporal power around the area of Rome. And Dante was talking about what a terrible idea this was. And this was, of course, predictably what the censor had gone for. But what was curious to me was he drew a single line through it so that you could still read it, right? So that the rest of the manuscript was immaculate and you could read exactly what it said, but it was clear that you were getting a signal from the censor, the inquisitor. You can read this, but understand we disapprove. And that's what I began to realize. The porosity and the complexity of the Inquisition is far greater than we often assume.
Yeah, and I think you're right. That's where I think Benito Arias Montano is so important. He worked for the Inquisition. He was also the man behind the king, Philip II. He was a diplomat, he was a spy, he was a librarian, he collected books, he spoke 10 languages and could do anything he wanted, and he would never get sent up to the Inquisition. And so what he did, King Philip gave him all this money and said, go everywhere and bring all the Jewish texts you can find. And so he'd bring them in, and then he would draw little lines through everything. And then he would also facilitate the books coming to the Americas. And if it wasn't for him, probably the Monteros papers might not have existed.
Yes, sir.
Well, just a brief comment. I'm really glad that we are treating this topic from the literary point of view, not the historian, because as a historian, I feel that when you say that, like party poopers, when we have arguments and say, oh, well, they're wrong, and this is a bad book, we like writing reviews and say, well, don't buy this book, or yes, buy this book, and I don't see the point here in doing that, because this is a topic that has deep roots, right? It's about faith, it's about respect, it's about something that is in the inner core of I was thinking about the criollos and peninsulares distinction, and I think it's really important to, if we want to find a similar case, instead of looking to Disneyland or to Mickey Mouse, to look to South America, because we have the Virgin of Guadalupe, right? The Argentine equivalent. The point, I mean, the most important thing is that it's the icon, and as an icon, you have to keep distance. Otherwise, it turns into a product that is part of the marketing, and we know about marketing nowadays. So, if we turn this into something that is something to sell outside the basilica, but that's a problem because we are just disrespecting a tradition that we don't know when actually started, right? So I just wanted to thank you. And I think, after all, faith has to do with pride, because here we are told that, you know, you are the pride. It's like the slogan of this university, right? I was thinking about that. It's like, yeah, I mean, why not? I mean, I don't need a third person to say you are the pride. So I feel special or powerful, and I don't. So I think that at the end of the day, it's a matter of respect, of national identity, and Mexico has a big problem with regards to national identity, and especially I think it's important to look at South America, because the distinction between criollos and peninsulares has nothing to do. I mean, there's one thing is Mexico, Central America, and whole different stories. South America, where the criollo means different things. It has, I mean, I'm thinking of the figure of Atahualpa Yupanqui, the singer, the folklore singer, and he said, I'm criollo. I'm living as a criollo, even though I have indigenous blood. I'm a mixture of the gaucho or the gaucho in Brazil and the Indian, but I'm playing the guitar, the Spanish guitar. So there's no point in discussing what no one's right here. It's just a matter of understanding, and that's the point of culture, I believe. So thank you.
Thank you. One thing I want to mention is Sanchez's book came out in 1648, but 7 years later it was seriously edited, where all these references to the Inquisition and Esther and everything else in there except the apparitions, everything was taken out, and it was made into a very small booklet by Matias de la Cruz, and that was the one that really was distributed. This original book was not, and it was deemed unfortunate by a lot of scholars. So she was sort of commodified with this abridged version. And it also makes me wonder too about they wanted to take it out because maybe some of the stuff was inflammatory.
I have a question really for Lois, which is, you know, we understand a lot in the development of Christianity how an interest in the Virgin Mary helped to canalize millennia, literally, of devotion to female deities that were kind of pushed out by the patriarchal nature of Christian monotheism. And so I'm just wondering, you know, was there already something being sort of channeled into the Virgin of Guadalupe and the part of indigenous culture, which I'm completely ignorant, hence my question.
But that's a great point. I mean, there's a huge pantheon among the indigenous groups in Mexico. There were lots of gods and lots of goddesses. And the detail, again, whether this is constructed by the Catholic Church to encourage indigenous peoples to become Catholic, that's the cynical view, or whether it really happened, or whether we believe that there's a lot of belief in the fact that it happened. The Virgin appeared to Juan Diego at Tepeyac, a hill that was outside of Mexico City, of course now absolutely enveloped by the city, where there was worship of Tonantzin, who was the mother goddess, or a mother goddess. So there's a huge conflation of Tonantzin and Guadalupe. And in fact, for a while, despite the Nican Mopua that says, oh yes, the bishop immediately embraced this apparition when he saw the image, there were at least 3 or 4 decades, and probably more, of real fear that this was an idolatrous matter. And the priests, the Mendicant Orders that came almost instantly, 1524 was the first group, the Franciscans. They were enjoined to watch out for idolatry, because suddenly it's monotheistic, and this is monotheism. We aren't going to have any of these gods. There's a book called Idols Behind Altars, which talks about the ways in which the indigenous belief system was still very much present and operating in early Christianity, but there was a lot of worry about idolatry, precisely because this Virgin Guadalupe had appeared exactly where there was an indigenous goddess, Tonantzin, who was worshipped. To this day, there is that kind of interesting mixture, and again, this takes us back to our questions of cultural hybridity, mixing, appropriation, whatever we want to say. I like the word transculturation, because when two cultures meet and cohabit for a period, a new culture is going to be formed. And here we are in America, we should certainly know that. So thank you for that question. It's channeling. I like that word a lot. There was a lot of channeling, and it is a lot of channeling.
Well, this is one of the reasons why the religions of the ancient world can be so difficult to study. Studying ancient Egyptian religion will give you a headache, because the amount of syncretism of different figures, the way in which they blend into each other, is dizzying. And one of the interesting things about it, since they weren't concerned with propositional theology, is of course they could live the contradictions and not worry about them. So the great example would be Artemis of Ephesus, one of the greatest cult sites in the ancient world in what is today Turkey. Artemis is a Greek goddess who is a virgin huntress, as I'm sure you know. But if you look at the image, the very famous image of Artemis of Ephesus, it's clearly an Anatolian mother goddess, right? Mm-hmm. So this contradiction just was, not an issue, because what went on there was cultic activity and not some sort of propositional theology where they had to work this out. So there you saw the transculturation or hybridity, in full force.
Which bothered, as I already said, I think Catholicism and the Catholic conversion experience for centuries in Mexico, because Catholicism is the one true religion, and it's monotheistic, and we aren't going, lots of saints, of course, but we're not going to permit anything like the kind of description that you just made of this goddess. So again, the currents come and go and mix and match, and sometimes conflict. I liked Jason's comment about competing cultures and common beliefs. There's something there that's right, I think.
Well, I don't know how you feel, but we have all these refreshments that aren't being consumed. And I'm hoping that those of us who have stayed to the end here really can continue the conversation, perhaps in more relaxed form, if that's all right with everyone. Thank you all for coming.